We describe life in slavery. As discussed, the transatlantic slave trade started as a very loose system of capture, trade, and recapture that developed into an organized triangle trade. Several Europeans questioned the morality and legality of keeping fellow human beings in bondage. Queen Isabella had these concerns from the very beginning of the Age of Exploration when Christopher Columbus brought her 200 natives in chains. African kings like Alfonso I spent their lifetimes trying to stop the peculiar institution, even as they saw plantation owners declaring they need more legal rights to recapture slaves who joined maroon societies. Africans took every advantage they could to resist, flee, and form these maroon colonies, most notably in Jamaica. This all changed with the passing of slave codes. These codes began to be passed throughout various colonies and declared Africans could be treated like cattle, in that they would be seen as property and bound to their owner, who could do whatever he wanted to with them, which included beatings, mutilations, rapes, separation from families, and recapture. First enacted in the Spanish colonies, the African slaves would have very few rights under these codes. Some codes granted them the right to a house, clothing, and food, but very few codes stated the condition that any of these items would be delivered in. Most sources say the most influential one was the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. The Barbados Code would go on to influence other English colonies like Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. It was better known at the time as an act for better ordering and governing of Negroes. It established punishments like whipping on the first offense, whipping, nose slit, and face burned on the second offense, and didn't limit dismemberment on any offense. Slaves were going to be denied the English right to trial, and no one was to be held accountable for a loss of life of a slave. British slavery and Spanish slavery differed in that British slavery began to rely heavily on breeding slave populations for more slaves, whereas Spain purchased their slaves from other empires through the Asiento. Spanish slaves served in a variety of functions that almost mirrored traditional slavery. One example of this is Estevanico, who was seen as an equal in the plagued Florida explorations of Cabeza de Vaca and was given credit for opening up Arizona to Spanish settlement. Life on the plantation system typically involved 6 days of work for 14 hours a day. Slaves from West Africa introduced the shotgun-style design of housing to the Americas, which would eventually become a widespread style throughout American cities. There was no guarantee of food, hence the slave gardens we discussed in the last video. If a slave lived on a small farm, chances of eating were even less. Typically, large plantations employed an overseer who developed a reputation for cruelty. Sometimes the plantations employed drivers. These were slaves hired to manage other slaves and were given extra privileges for the job. Because the Atlantic slave trade was purely based on race, a racial hierarchy began to evolve within the sad institution, almost with uniformity among all colonies. Slave society began to develop around the shade of skin one had. Native Africans, known as saltwater slaves, faced harder field work, whereas lighter-skinned Creoles who were born in slavery and mulattoes who were born of sexual exploitation of white masters and slave women were given house jobs and chances to earn their freedom.